The bathroom mirror in the courthouse hallway reflected a woman Sarah Mitchell barely recognized. Dark circles hung beneath her eyes like bruises, and the lines around her mouth had deepened considerably over the past 8 months. She leaned against the cold sink, gripping the porcelain edges until her knuckles turned white. Her reflection stared back at her, exhausted, frightened, and fighting desperately to maintain composure for what would be the most important day of her life. 8 months. That's how long the custody battle had consumed her existence. 8 months of lawyers' fees that had depleted her savings. 8 months of sleepless nights filled with anxiety-driven racing thoughts, and 8 months of emotional warfare orchestrated by a man she'd once promised to spend her life with. The irony was almost unbearable. Sarah splashed cold water on her face, trying to shock herself into a state of alertness. The icy water felt cleansing, though she knew nothing could truly wash away the weight she carried. She checked her reflection one final time, smoothing down her navy blazer and ensuring her appearance was impeccable. First impressions mattered, especially in front of Judge, who was known for scrutinizing everything, from testimony authenticity to the subtle body language of parents fighting for their children. The case file sat open on the bathroom counter, though Sarah had memorized every document weeks ago. She'd read through her own testimony so many times that the words no longer felt real, as though someone else had written them. But they were her words, describing her side of a marriage that had fractured so completely that the person she'd loved had transformed into a predator bent on destroying her credibility. David had been systematic and calculated in his attacks. He told mutual friends, people Sarah considered family, that she was emotionally unstable and incapable of proper decision-making. He'd arranged deliberately inconvenient visitation times, then reported her to his lawyer each time she couldn't accommodate his last-minute changes, painting her as irresponsible and uncooperative. Worse, he'd filed false reports to Child Protective Services, claiming she neglected Emma and exposed her to unsafe living conditions. Each report had been thoroughly investigated and dismissed as unfounded, but the damage to Sarah's peace of mind was cumulative and devastating. She'd been the primary caregiver throughout their entire 12-year marriage. When Emma was born, Sarah made the conscious decision to leave her graphic design career to be a full-time mother. David had supported this decision initially, even enthusiastically, but as the marriage deteriorated, he weaponized that very choice against her. His lawyer had already planted seeds during previous hearings that staying home didn't constitute professional achievement, and that Sarah's career gap made her unreliable in the eyes of modern family courts. The irony was suffocating. Sarah had sacrificed everything: her professional advancement, her financial independence, her sense of identity, to nurture their daughter through those critical early years. She'd read to Emma every single night, attended every developmental milestone, and created a home filled with unconditional love. And now that love was being positioned as evidence of her inadequacy. A knock on the bathroom door jarred her from her thoughts. "Mrs. Mitchell, we're about ready to begin," a court officer called politely. Sarah took a deep breath, mentally steeling herself. This was it. The culmination of 8 months of preparation, legal fees, psychological evaluations, and character testimony. She stepped out of the bathroom and immediately spotted her attorney, reviewing notes by the courtroom entrance. Was a brilliant lawyer, one of the most respected family law attorneys in the state, and Sarah had stretched her finances to the absolute limit to afford her. Had assured her that the evidence was solid, that truth and genuine maternal love would prevail. But as Sarah looked at its expression, she could see the shadow of uncertainty that even the most experienced lawyers carry into contested custody cases. Then Sarah's eyes found Emma, sitting on a bench near the courtroom doors, swinging her small legs that didn't quite reach the floor. Her daughter wore a pink dress that Sarah had carefully selected the night before, nothing too formal or intimidating, but something that looked sweet and innocent. Emma was occupied with a small coloring book, her tongue poking slightly out of her mouth in concentration as she carefully colored a princess's dress. Seeing Emma brought tears to Sarah's eyes, which she immediately blinked away. She couldn't afford to show weakness before entering the courtroom. Judges responded to strength, composure, and certainty. She couldn't present herself as the anxious, vulnerable wreck that she'd become over the past months. Sarah had intended to leave Emma with her mother, Carol, who'd promised to watch her for the day. They'd planned for months that Carol would take Emma to the park, keep her occupied and happy far away from the stress and tension of the courtroom. But this morning, Carol had called in tears. Sarah's father had suffered a minor heart attack overnight, and while doctors assured them he'd recover fully, Carol needed to be at the hospital immediately. The choice had been agonizing. Taking Emma to the courthouse felt wrong and risky, but the alternative, postponing the hearing, wasn't viable. Judge had already rescheduled once, and another delay could be interpreted as Sarah's lack of commitment to resolving the matter. The court officer had assured her that Emma could remain in the back of the courtroom during proceedings. Children occasionally appeared in custody hearings, and it wasn't forbidden. Plus, Emma's presence might actually reinforce Sarah's testimony about being a devoted, hands-on mother. Sarah approached her daughter and knelt down beside her, studying Emma's face carefully. This beautiful 3-year-old girl had no idea that her entire future hung in the balance today. To Emma, this was just another day, a slightly different location where Mommy had to do something boring while Emma could color. "Hi, sweetie," Sarah whispered, smoothing Emma's golden hair. "We're going to go into that room now and Mommy has to talk to some people. You're going to sit right here with your coloring book, okay? You can be my special helper by being very quiet and very good. Can you do that for Mommy?" Emma nodded seriously, her young face solemn with the responsibility of being Mommy's helper. She had no concept that her mere presence was Sarah's silent argument. "Look at us together. Look at this bond. This is a mother who would never hurt this child. This is a mother who deserves to keep her daughter." Sarah held Emma close for a moment, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and the innocent sweetness of childhood. She whispered a silent prayer to whatever forces govern justice and fairness in the universe. This day would determine whether she'd continue raising her precious daughter or lose her to a man she now feared. It would determine whether truth prevailed or lies conquered. It would determine the trajectory of both their lives. Approached and placed a reassuring hand on Sarah's shoulder. "It's time," she said quietly. Sarah took Emma's hand and stood, straightening her blazer one final time. She looked directly into his eyes and nodded, a small gesture that communicated her resolve. Whatever happened in that courtroom, she would fight with every ounce of strength she possessed. As they entered the courthouse chambers, Sarah whispered one final promise to her daughter. "Mommy's going to make sure everything is okay. I promise." She had no idea that this promise would soon be tested in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The courtroom was a cathedral of judgment, all mahogany and marble designed to remind ordinary people that they were entering a place where their fates would be decided by others. Sarah's footsteps echoed slightly as she and made their way down the aisle toward the plaintiff's table. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed, expectant atmosphere. Every eye in the gallery turned toward them, court clerks, a handful of observers, and most importantly, David and his attorney, Richard Thornton. Richard Thornton was precisely the kind of lawyer that made Sarah's stomach turn. In his late 50s, with silver hair styled perfectly, and an expensive suit that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent, he represented a specific breed of legal predator. Men who won cases not necessarily through superior evidence or righteous arguments, but through psychological warfare and the strategic manipulation of courtroom dynamics. Sarah had researched him thoroughly. His track record in custody cases was intimidating, 87% victory rate, with the majority of wins going to the fathers he represented. He had a reputation for being ruthless, for turning minor inconsistencies in a mother's testimony into enormous red flags, for painting devoted mothers as unstable, and for positioning often questionable fathers as misunderstood heroes. David sat beside Thornton with posture that screamed confidence. He wore a dark suit that Sarah recognized. She'd picked it out with him years ago, back when their marriage was intact and they shopped together like normal couples. His expression was carefully constructed, not too smug but definitely assured. He'd been coached, Sarah realized. Thornton had clearly prepped him on how to appear sympathetic, concerned, and reasonable. It was a calculated performance, and the jury of one judge would be his audience. David's eyes caught Sarah's for just a moment, and she saw something flicker in that gaze. Was it contempt, triumph, or was she projecting her own fear onto his expression? She quickly looked away, not wanting to sense her doubts. Squeezed Sarah's shoulder as they settled into their chairs. "Stay strong," she whispered. "Remember what we discussed. Answer questions directly, don't elaborate unnecessarily, and maintain eye contact with the judge." Sarah nodded, unable to trust her voice. Her mouth felt dry as though someone had lined it with cotton. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, a rhythmic pounding that made it difficult to concentrate. This was really happening. After 8 months of depositions, document reviews, and legal strategy sessions, they were finally here. The bailiff stood. "All rise, the Honorable Presiding." Judge entered with the authority of someone who'd spent 30 years in family court. She was a woman in her early 60s, with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a professional bun. Her face was stern but not unkind, though Sarah had read enough case law involving her to know that kindness wasn't necessarily an asset in her courtroom. Judge was known for being intellectually rigorous and emotionally detached. She applied the law with precision and expected both attorneys to do the same. The judge took her seat and looked between the two tables with an expression that suggested she'd already heard far too many stories like this one today. "Please be seated. We're here in the matter of Mitchell versus Mitchell, custody case number 2024 CV 87451. I've reviewed all submitted documents, depositions, and evidence from both parties. Before we begin opening statements, I want to be clear about the expectations in my courtroom. This is a custody hearing, not a character assassination forum. I'm interested in facts, not rhetoric. I'm interested in what's best for the minor child, not in punishing either party for marital dissolution. Is that understood by both counsels?" "Yes, Your Honor," and Thornton responded simultaneously. "Very well. Mr. Thornton, as the respondent's counsel, you may begin with your opening statement." Richard Thornton stood with theatrical grace, buttoning his jacket with practiced precision. "Your Honor, thank you. This case, at its heart, is about a child's welfare and stability. My client, David Mitchell, has always been an involved, loving father. He takes his responsibilities seriously. However, the child's primary residential parent has exhibited patterns of concerning behavior that directly impact the child's emotional well-being." He paced slowly as he spoke, making strategic eye contact with the judge. "The evidence will demonstrate that the petitioner has made deliberate choices that prioritize her own needs over her daughter's stability. We will show documentation of missed appointments, inconsistent arrangements, and statements from reliable witnesses that the child has expressed anxiety and confusion about her mother's emotional state." Sarah felt tense beside her. They both knew these were exaggerations and outright fabrications, but watching Thornton present them with such confident authority made them sound plausible. This was his skill, taking half-truths and fragments of context and weaving them into a narrative that sounded devastatingly damaging. Thornton continued for another 5 minutes, painting a picture of David as a stable, concerned father fighting to protect his daughter from an emotionally unstable mother. When he finally sat down, Sarah saw him lean over and whisper something to David. David nodded slightly, and she caught a glimpse of what might have been a suppressed smile. Then stood for her opening statement, and Sarah was struck by the contrast in styles. Where Thornton had been theatrical and emotional, was precise and factual. She presented the actual documentation, logs showing Sarah's consistent presence and involvement, medical records demonstrating Emma's excellent health, testimony from Emma's preschool teacher confirming that the child was happy and well-adjusted. Your Honor, concluded, the evidence will show that Sarah Mitchell has been and continues to be an exemplary mother who has sacrificed tremendously for her daughter's welfare. The allegations against her are not supported by objective evidence and appear to be part of a coordinated effort to undermine her credibility without legitimate cause. As sat down, the judge made a few notes. Then she looked up and fixed her gaze on Sarah. Mrs. Mitchell, your attorney indicates you wish to testify on your own behalf. Yes, Your Honor, Sarah answered, her voice sounding smaller than she'd intended. Very well, you'll be sworn in momentarily. But before Sarah could process what was happening, before she could take the stand and defend herself against the web of accusations Thornton had just woven, something caught her eye. Emma had grown restless in the back of the courtroom. The coloring book wasn't engaging her anymore, and she was squirming slightly on the bench. Sarah's concentration fractured. How long could she keep Emma quiet and compliant? How long before her daughter became bored and started making noise? How would Judge react if a small child disrupted the proceedings? Would that somehow reflect negatively on Sarah's parenting? As if sensing her mother's anxiety, Emma looked up and made eye contact with Sarah. Her daughter's face was confused and perhaps a little frightened by the formal, serious nature of the courtroom environment. Sarah tried to offer a reassuring smile, but she wasn't sure it came across as anything but forced and anxious. The bailiff approached Sarah. Please raise your right hand to be sworn in. Sarah stood on shaky legs and placed her hand on the Bible, swearing to tell the truth. As she settled into the witness stand, positioned directly across from where David sat, she felt the full weight of the moment crushing down on her. Thornton approached with a predatory smile. Mrs. Mitchell, I have just a few questions for you. Let's start with last March when you failed to pick up Emma from on time. Sarah's stomach twisted. Here it came, the barrage of accusations, misinterpretations, and strategic questioning designed to make her appear unreliable, unstable, and unfit. She gripped the edge of the witness stand and prepared herself for the fight of her life. Emma shifted uncomfortably on the bench behind her, and Sarah could feel her daughter's anxiety like a physical weight. Everything depended on the next few hours. Richard Thornton's voice was smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. He didn't shout or display obvious aggression. Instead, he employed a technique far more devastating. He asked seemingly innocent questions that carried hidden of implication. Sarah sat in the witness stand, her hands folded in her lap to prevent them from shaking visibly, as he methodically began his cross-examination. Mrs. Mitchell, you were the primary caregiver for Emma throughout your marriage. Is that correct? Yes, Sarah answered, following instructions to keep responses brief and direct. And when your husband worked, which was often, isn't it you remained at home with Emma? Yes, I chose to stay home to raise our daughter. Thornton tilted his head slightly, as though considering this information for the first time. You chose to stay home, but that meant your earning potential essentially ceased, correct? You had a career in graphic design before Emma's birth. I did, but... And that career is essentially non-existent now, is it? You haven't worked in that field for 3 years. No, I haven't worked professionally, but... So you have no current employment income. That's correct, but I've been available for Emma. Thornton held up his hand. Let me ask you about something specific. In March of this year, you failed to pick up Emma from by the 6:31 p.m. closing time. In fact, you didn't arrive until 6:47 p.m. Is that accurate? Sarah's heart sank. She'd been dreading this line of questioning. I was 5 minutes late. The director understood it was a traffic issue. Emma was fine. 16 minutes late, actually. And while I'm certain Emma was indeed fine, that has a strict closing time policy, doesn't it? There's a financial penalty for late pickup. Yes, but it was an isolated incident. Mrs. Mitchell, in fact, you were late for pickup on 3 separate occasions this year, weren't you? Sarah wanted to scream that one of those times had been when her car broke down, another when a water pipe burst in her apartment. But Thornton had already moved on to his next question, never giving her the opportunity to explain. Now, regarding your residence, you live in an apartment in the Riverside neighborhood, correct? Not a house with a yard. Yes, it's a 2-bedroom apartment. And Mr. Mitchell has expressed concerns that this apartment isn't adequate for a growing child, that Emma lacks outdoor space to play. Had warned her about this. David's lawyer would try to make her modest living situation sound negligent. It's a safe apartment. Emma and I visit the park regularly. We have everything we need. But it's less space than what Mr. Mitchell provides during his visitation time, isn't it? He maintains a house with a yard, correct? He does, but a house with significantly more room for a child to play and explore. The line of questioning was insidious. Thornton wasn't directly attacking Sarah's character. He was instead building a subtle narrative, a father with more resources and space, a mother struggling financially in a modest apartment, a father providing opportunities, a mother providing what? Emotional support. That was harder to quantify and defend in a courtroom. Sarah glanced back at Emma, who was now sitting very still on the bench, her small body tense as though she could sense her mother's distress. Their eyes met for just a moment before Sarah forced her attention back to Thornton, who had moved on to his next line of attack. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm going to show you some text messages. These are messages between you and your sister, Jennifer, correct? Had reviewed these messages with Sarah, and Sarah knew exactly where this was heading. Thornton displayed a text where Sarah had written, I'm completely overwhelmed today. I don't think I can do this anymore. This message was sent on May 15th of this year. Can you explain what you meant by, I don't think I can do this anymore? Sarah's face flushed. The context was that Emma had been ill, Sarah's car had broken down, and she'd missed an important court deadline due to stress. I was having a difficult day. I meant. You meant you couldn't handle motherhood. You couldn't handle raising Emma. No, I was stressed about the legal situation. Emma was sick. It was just one bad day. Thornton held up another text. And 3 days later, you sent this message to your mother. I'm terrified I'm going to screw this up and David's going to take Emma away. I've been crying all night. Were you crying in front of Emma while she was ill? Objected, but the damage was done. The implication hung in the air. A mother so emotionally unstable that she was having emotional breakdowns in front of her sick daughter. Sarah's mouth felt dry. She looked desperately toward, but her attorney was making notes, preparing for her redirect examination. Sarah wanted to scream that she'd only cried after Emma was asleep, that she'd been incredibly supportive while her daughter was ill, that having anxiety about a custody case didn't make her an unfit mother. But the damage was accumulating like snow during a blizzard, each accusation adding another layer, making it harder to see the truth beneath. Now, I'd like to discuss your interactions with Emma during her visitation periods with her father, Thornton continued. My client has reported that Emma seems anxious when she's about to go with him. She cries, clings to you. Would you agree that Emma exhibits this behavior? Sarah hesitated. Emma did sometimes cry when dropped off for visitation, but that was normal separation anxiety. Emma is 3 years old. It's normal for young children to have difficulty with transitions. But you've never tried to minimize this anxiety. Never attempted to make the transition easier for Emma. Of course I have. I try very hard to make transitions smooth. Yet Emma continues to cry and cling, despite your efforts. The implication was clear and twisted. Either Sarah wasn't actually making good efforts, or she was somehow encouraging Emma's anxiety because she wanted to interfere with David's visitation. It was brilliantly Machiavellian. Had warned Sarah that this would happen, but experiencing it was entirely different from anticipating it. Each question felt like a carefully placed brick in a wall designed to bury her credibility under an avalanche of doubt. By lunchtime, when the judge called for a recess, Sarah felt utterly devastated. Thornton had systematically dismantled her narrative. He hadn't directly called her a liar, hadn't made obvious accusations of abuse or neglect. Instead, he'd woven together fragments of truth with distortions and implications until the picture he'd painted bore little resemblance to her actual life and values. In the courthouse hallway during lunch, Sarah held Emma close, her daughter's small body the only solid thing in a world that suddenly felt terrifyingly unstable. Spoke quietly but with obvious concern. "He's very good, better than I anticipated. We're going to need to refocus your testimony this afternoon. You need to be stronger on direct examination and address some of his implications head-on." Sarah nodded numbly, but inside, panic was rising like floodwater. The afternoon session would present her chance to rehabilitate her testimony, but she could see David across the hallway, sitting with Thornton and his mother. David's expression was calm, collected, almost pitying. He looked like a man who was already confident in the outcome. Something twisted in Sarah's stomach. What if she lost? What if no matter what she said this afternoon, the damage had already been done? What if she'd miscalculated by bringing Emma to court today? She had no way of knowing that her deepest fears were about to become irrelevant, about to be shattered by something completely unexpected. She had no way of knowing that the afternoon session would bring a revelation that would change everything. The afternoon session began with Sarah in a mental fog. She'd barely eaten lunch, her stomach churning with anxiety. Had spent the recess drilling her on how to answer questions more forcefully, how to directly contradict Thornton's characterizations. But confidence felt impossible. Sarah could sense the judge's skepticism, could see the subtle way Judge had taken notes during Thornton's cross-examination. She'd underlined several points, and each underline felt like a vote against Sarah. Now, back in the courtroom, Thornton was continuing his cross-examination with renewed vigor. He'd moved on from attacking Sarah's financial stability to questioning her involvement in Emma's daily activities. "You mentioned attending Emma's preschool events. How many times in the past 6 months have you been present for classroom activities?" "I've tried to attend as many as possible," Sarah answered, her voice sounding weaker than she intended. "Emma's preschool has weekly story time, and I attend when I can afford the time." "How many times specifically?" "I believe 4 or 5 times. Thornton raised his eyebrows. "Out of approximately 24 possible weeks, you managed to attend 4 or 5 times. That's roughly 20% attendance. Would you characterize that as highly involved parenting?" Sarah wanted to defend herself, to explain that she'd been dealing with legal matters, that Emma's preschool was expensive and required advance registration, that presence didn't equal love. But she'd learned from the morning session that explanations just gave Thornton more ammunition. "I'm as involved as I can be given the circumstances," she said quietly. Made notes, her expression growing more concerned. The redirect examination would be crucial, but Sarah wasn't sure anything could repair the damage at this point. Thornton was about to launch into another question when something shifted in the courtroom atmosphere. There was a subtle change in air pressure, a slight increase in ambient noise. The courtroom door had opened. A police officer entered with a German Shepherd at his side, a magnificent animal, muscular and alert with a sleek tan and black coat. The officer was conducting a routine security sweep of the courthouse building. It was a standard procedure, something that happened several times per week as part of the courthouse's heightened security measures. Most people barely registered the presence of the K-9 unit. A few observers glanced up with mild interest before returning to their phones or notebooks. The judge didn't even look up from her papers. Thornton continued speaking, barely acknowledging the interruption. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'd like to return to the subject of. That's the same doggy." The voice cut through the courtroom like a knife. Everyone froze. Even the police officer and his dog stopped mid-stride. All heads turned toward the back of the courtroom where Emma sat, and in that frozen moment, Sarah felt her world tilt on its axis. Emma had stood up on the bench, her small body vibrating with excitement and a strange urgency that seemed disproportionate to the sight of a dog. She was pointing directly at the police dog with both intensity and a certainty that was unusual for a 3-year-old. "That's the same doggy. That's the same doggy that was at Daddy's house." The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. It was the kind of silence that precedes earthquakes, that comes just before lightning strikes. Sarah felt her heart physically stop beating for a moment. Judge looked up from her papers, her stern expression registering surprise. His head snapped toward Sarah with a confused look. Thornton's mouth actually fell open, a rare crack in his carefully controlled demeanor. David's entire body went rigid, his face draining of color. His mother, sitting behind him, gasped audibly. "What did she say?" Judge asked, her voice cutting through the shocked silence. Sarah's mind was racing in 1,000 directions simultaneously. A dog at David's house. This was the first she'd heard of this. David had never mentioned owning a dog. In fact, during the divorce proceedings, he had no pets. This statement from Emma came completely out of nowhere, a hand grenade tossed into the carefully controlled proceeding. The police officer looked uncertain about whether to proceed with his security sweep or pause. He exchanged a glance with the bailiff, then slowly started moving forward again, but with less certainty, clearly aware that something significant had just occurred. "Your Honor," said carefully standing up, "may I have a moment with my client?" "In a moment," Judge replied, her eyes fixed on Emma. "Young lady, can you come up here, please?" Sarah felt panic spike. She had no idea what Emma was talking about. She'd never heard about a dog at David's house, but Emma's certainty was terrifying. 3-year-olds didn't typically make detailed false claims about specific things. When children made things up, it was usually about fantastical scenarios, dragons, unicorns, magical adventures. This specific, definitive statement about a dog at Daddy's house had a ring of authentic memory. Emma climbed down from the bench and walked toward the judge's bench with the unself-conscious innocence of a small child who had no idea she just dropped a nuclear bomb on courtroom proceedings. Sarah wanted to call her back, wanted to grab her and flee, but she remained frozen in the witness stand. Judge leaned down to Emma's eye level. "Sweetheart, what's your name?" "I'm Emma," the girl said matter-of-factly. "That dog looks like the doggies at Daddy's house." "There are dogs at your daddy's house?" Emma nodded with the absolute certainty of someone recounting established fact. "In the basement. There's lots of them." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Lots of dogs. In the basement. This made no sense. David's house was a 2-story suburban home with a finished basement that he used as a media room. When Sarah had picked up Emma from visitation, she'd never seen or heard evidence of any dogs. "Are you sure?" the judge asked gently. Emma's small face scrunched in concentration. "They're in cages. The cages are big and dark, and the doggies sound sad." The courtroom felt like it was tilting. Sarah looked at David, expecting to see confusion or a denial forming on his face. Instead, she saw raw panic. His hands were gripping the table so hard his knuckles had turned white. His mother had gone completely pale. Thornton was leaning over whispering something urgent to David, whose jaw had clenched so tightly it looked like it might crack. "The dogs sound sad," Judge pressed. "What do you mean?" "They make growly sounds and crying sounds and—" Emma paused, her small brow furrowing as she searched for words. "And Daddy said I shouldn't talk about the doggies. He said they were a secret. He said if I told Mommy, something bad would happen." The courtroom erupted into absolute chaos. Not audible chaos, everyone remained eerily silent, but internal psychological chaos. Judge sat back, her expression transforming from judicial neutrality to something darker and more troubled. Stood up, her eyes wide with shock and rapidly shifting to urgent calculation. The police officer with his dog had stopped completely now, his hand instinctively moving to his belt as though preparing for potential trouble. Sarah felt as though she'd stepped into an alternate reality. She looked at Emma, trying to comprehend what her daughter was saying. Dogs in cages, in the basement, secret. Her mind was struggling to process the implications. David stood up abruptly. "Your Honor, I—" "Sit down," Judge commanded, her voice containing an edge Sarah had never heard before. "Bailiff, do not allow Mr. Mitchell to leave this courtroom." The bailiff moved toward David with clear purpose. Thornton grabbed his client's arm, forcing him back into his chair, clearly whispering urgent instructions about remaining silent. Judge looked at Emma with an expression that contained sadness, concern, and something darker, a dawning realization that extended far beyond a custody dispute. "Emma, I need to ask you some very important questions, and I need you to tell me the truth, okay? The complete truth. Can you do that for me?" Emma nodded solemnly, still unaware of the magnitude of what she was saying. And in that moment, everything Sarah thought she understood about her case, about David, about the entire custody battle, shattered like glass. Judge leaned forward, her stern judicial mask falling away to reveal genuine concern and something darker, the expression of someone who just realized they were encountering actual criminal activity in real time. She spoke to Emma with deliberate gentleness, the kind of voice used with victims and witnesses who'd survived trauma. "Emma, sweetheart, I want you to tell me more about these dogs. Are there a lot of them?" Emma nodded seriously, her small face scrunched in concentration as she tried to translate her 3-year-old understanding into words. "There's lots. I don't know how many. They're in cages. Some of the cages are really big and some are small. It's dark down there." "How do you know it's dark?" Judge asked carefully. "Because Daddy keeps the lights off. He said I shouldn't go down there when there are men visiting. He said the doggies need to be quiet, and if I made noise, it would make them upset." Sarah felt physically ill. The implications were becoming horrifyingly clear. This wasn't just about David owning a dog illegally. There was something profoundly wrong here, something criminal, something dangerous. "Emma, when you say men visit, what do they do?" "I don't know. Daddy makes me stay upstairs in my room, but I can hear them. They talk loud, and sometimes the dogs, they sound scary, like they're fighting." The word fighting hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Judge's expression hardened. She exchanged a significant glance with the police officer still standing near the courtroom entrance with his K9. Suddenly stood. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a 15-minute recess to consult with my client regarding these new developments." Judge said firmly, "We're in the middle of critical testimony. Officer," she gestured toward the police officer, "step forward, please." The officer walked to the judge's bench, his German shepherd moving calmly beside him. Judge spoke to him in low tones, but Sarah could make out fragments. Possible animal cruelty, criminal activity, warrant. David was now visibly shaking. He tried to stand again, and Thornton practically dragged him back down, hissing urgent warnings. The color had completely drained from David's face, leaving him looking like a corpse. "Emma," Judge continued, "can you describe what the dogs look like? Are they all the same kind of dog?" Emma tilted her head, considering. "They're different. Some are big and brown, some are black, some have spots. They all look sad, and some of them have bandages on them." "Bandages?" "Like on their legs and faces and stuff. I asked Daddy why, and he said they played too rough. But—" Emma's voice dropped to a whisper, her instinctive childhood wisdom detecting something fundamentally wrong. "But they didn't look like they were playing. They looked like they hurt. Sarah stood up abruptly, then sat back down, unable to process what she was hearing. Her daughter, her precious daughter, had been exposed to this. Emma had been in a house where animals were being brutalized, and Sarah had sent her there. She'd been so focused on the custody battle, so convinced David was just being difficult and manipulative, that she hadn't paid enough attention to subtle changes in Emma's behavior. The nightmares, the withdrawn moments, her reluctance to discuss visitation days. Judge's expression had transformed entirely. She was no longer a judge presiding over a custody dispute. She was looking at Emma like a witness to serious criminal activity. She gestured to the bailiff. "Contact animal control immediately, and get me the prosecutor's office. I'm going to need to file a report with law enforcement." "Your Honor," Thornton interjected, "my client hasn't been accused of anything. You're making extraordinary leaps." "Mr. Thornton, I would suggest you cease speaking before you make this worse for your client," Judge said coldly. "Officer, you need to obtain a warrant for this address immediately." She gestured to David. "What is your residential address?" David's lawyer put his hand on David's arm, signaling him not to speak, but it was too late. Judge had David's address from the case files in front of her. She wrote it down and handed it to the officer. "I want a warrant executed today, and I want documentation of every animal found on that property." The officer nodded crisply and stepped away, already making calls on his phone. Sarah watched as he moved to a quiet corner of the courtroom, speaking urgently into his cellular device. "Emma," Judge said, refocusing on the girl, "I have one more very important question for you. Did Daddy ever tell you not to tell Mommy about the dogs?" Emma's small face went serious. She looked back at Sarah, her eyes uncertain. Then she nodded slowly. "He said if I told Mommy, something bad would happen. He said she might not be allowed to be my mommy anymore. He said I had to keep it a secret." Sarah felt the words like a physical blow. David had threatened their relationship to keep Emma silent. He'd weaponized her love for her mother to ensure compliance and silence. The custody battle suddenly transformed into something far more sinister. It hadn't been about winning Emma. It had been about maintaining access to her so she couldn't report what she was witnessing. Rushed over and embraced Sarah, who was now visibly trembling. "This changes everything," whispered. "Everything." Judge looked at the police officer who'd moved back toward the bench, phone still pressed to his ear. He gave her a thumbs-up gesture. She nodded with grim satisfaction. "This hearing is adjourned pending criminal investigation," Judge announced to the courtroom. "Mr. David Mitchell, you are not to leave this building pending police interview. Officer, please ensure he remains available. Mrs. Mitchell," the judge looked directly at Sarah, "you are to retain full custody of Emma, pending the outcome of criminal proceedings. All visitation with Mr. Mitchell is suspended indefinitely. This court will reconvene to address custody matters once the criminal investigation reaches certain conclusions." She looked down at Emma with something approaching tenderness mixed with sorrow. "Emma, you did something very brave today. What you told me is going to help a lot of doggies, and it's going to keep you safe. I want you to know that. Do you understand?" Emma nodded, though she clearly didn't fully comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. The bailiff approached David, reading him his rights regarding the investigation. David's expensive lawyer was now making urgent calls himself, his confident demeanor crumbling. Thornton looked shell-shocked, as though he'd walked into an elaborate trap that had been set entirely by accident. As Sarah held Emma close, watching the courtroom descend into controlled chaos, she felt a tsunami of emotions crashing over her. Relief that custody was no longer in question, horror at what her daughter had been exposed to, guilt for not having seen the signs sooner, anger at David for threatening Emma into silence. But underneath it all was a strange sense of vindication. The truth had emerged not through her testimony or legal arguments, but through the innocent, honest words of a 3-year-old girl who couldn't help but point out what she'd seen. The officer with the German Shepherd moved toward the exit, his phone pressed to his ear, discussing warrant execution and evidence collection. Within hours, David's house would be swarming with police, animal control officers, and investigators. What they would find would exceed even the horrifying details Emma had provided. The warrant was obtained within 2 hours. By 3:30 p.m., David's suburban home was surrounded by police vehicles, animal control trucks, and investigators. The quiet cul-de-sac, the kind of neighborhood where nothing unusual ever happened, was transformed into an active crime scene. Officer stood at the basement door, prepared for what evidence suggested he might find. He'd been with the K-9 unit for 8 years, had worked countless cases involving animal welfare violations, but something about this one felt different. A 3-year-old girl's innocent testimony had cracked open what appeared to be an extensive criminal operation. "Ready?" his partner, Detective Sarah, asked. Officer nodded. They descended the basement stairs together, emergency lights illuminating the darkness that Emma had described with such accuracy. The basement was a nightmare made manifest. 12 dogs occupied stacked metal cages arranged throughout the space. The smell hit them immediately: urine, feces, decay, and something else, something distinctly organic and wrong. Several dogs reacted to the presence of the officers, some barking defensively, others cowering in corners. The animals displayed injuries consistent with fighting: torn ears, faces, lacerated bodies, missing patches of fur where wounds had healed. "Jesus," Detective breathed, her hand instinctively covering her mouth. Officer was already photographing everything. Medical equipment designed specifically for dog fighting lay on tables. Syringes, medications, several clearly stolen veterinary pharmaceuticals, suture kits, and documentation of injuries. On the walls, charts tracked each dog's performance in fights, with notations about wins, losses, and betting payouts. "We're going to need to document everything," said, her voice tight with controlled rage. This is extensive." They moved deeper into the basement. A second room contained betting records, fight schedules, and financial documentation. Officer felt his stomach turn as he examined the files. The operation was sophisticated and highly organized. There were videotapes labeled with dates and fight details. Betting sheets showed astronomical amounts wagered on individual matches. One sheet from 3 weeks earlier documented a fight between 2 dogs labeled Beast and Killer, with payouts totaling $42,000 on that single fight. $42,000. In another corner of the basement sat a veterinary triage area clearly designed for post-fight medical treatment, not to heal the dogs, but to get them back into fighting condition as quickly as possible. Bottles of steroids, antibiotics, and pain management medications lined the shelves. A document titled Combat Recovery Protocol outlined treatment schedules designed to maximize fighter availability. "This has been going on for a while," observed, examining dated receipts. "These go back 18 months, look at this." She pointed to equipment purchase receipts: commercial video cameras, streaming equipment, paid hosting services. This wasn't just local fighting. They were broadcasting fights online. Officer felt cold fury building in his chest. Online dog fighting reached an audience of tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands. The scope of this criminal enterprise was expanding exponentially with each discovery. They found the financial records next, bank statements showing regular deposits under various business names: North Valley Landscaping, Premium Pet Care Services, Riverside Security Consultants. The names were clearly shells, fronts for the actual enterprise. Over 18 months, approximately $237,000 had been deposited into accounts associated with David Mitchell. $237,000. "He's been making serious money from this," said, documenting everything with photographs. "This is not an amateur operation. This is a criminal enterprise." Upstairs, other officers were executing the search warrant on the rest of the property. They discovered a locked office containing detailed records about individual fighters' histories, photographs of dogs in various stages of injury, and payment records from people across multiple states. The scope was regional, possibly national. In David's desk, they found correspondence with other known dog fighters. Text messages on his confiscated cell phone revealed an entire network of individuals involved in the conspiracy. One message dated just 2 days earlier read, "The little one's getting curious. Might need to adjust visitation schedule or find another solution." Detective felt a chill. Another solution. They would never know what that meant, but the implication was terrifying. Emma's increasing awareness and questions represented a threat to the operation, and David had been considering options to neutralize that threat. By late evening, the full inventory had been documented. 12 dogs had been rescued from the basement. 12 living creatures that had been systematically brutalized and exploited for profit. 3 of the dogs had injuries so severe that veterinarians weren't certain they would survive the recovery process. The veterinary examination revealed an even darker reality. One dog, a pit bull mix identified in records as Champion, bore evidence of at least 43 separate documented fights. Another dog, labeled Queen, had been forced to breed repeatedly, producing puppies that had likely been used to replenish the fighting stock. The psychological trauma was evident. Some dogs cowered at sudden movements, others displayed extreme aggression, and several appeared to be in early stages of organ failure from steroid abuse. As the evening progressed, David's entire home was processed as a crime scene. The careful facade of suburban normalcy concealed an industrial-scale animal abuse operation. Every document, every photograph, every piece of equipment was as evidence. At the police station, David was formally arrested on charges of operating an illegal dog fighting establishment, animal cruelty, multiple counts, 1 per documented animal, illegal gambling on animal fighting, money laundering through the shell business accounts, wire fraud using internet services to broadcast fights, child endangerment for exposing Emma to the operation. The last charge carried particular weight. Emma hadn't just witnessed animal abuse. She'd been deliberately kept silent through threats and psychological manipulation. The fact that a 3-year-old had been used as an unwitting accomplice to criminal activity elevated the severity of the charges dramatically. David's public defender listened to the charges with a pale, horrified expression. He'd represented dozens of clients over his career, but dog fighting operations were rare in his experience, and the combination of animal cruelty with child endangerment was particularly egregious. How did law enforcement discover this? The public defender asked during the intake process. The defendant's daughter, officer responded, 3 years old, saw our K-9 unit in court during a custody hearing and identified it as being the same type of dog she'd seen in the basement. That comment led to the warrant. The public defender closed his eyes, clearly understanding that David's case was essentially back at the animal rescue organization that had been called to receive the rescued dogs. Veterinarians and behavioral specialists began the long process of treating physical and psychological injuries. One elderly veterinarian doctor looked at the condition of the rescued animals and wept openly. "How is any animal supposed to recover from this?" she asked her staff. "The cruelty, the systematic violence, the exploitation. Some of these dogs may never trust humans again." But despite the damage, there was also determined hope. These 12 animals had survived. They'd been liberated, and their liberation would result in dismantling an entire criminal network that extended across multiple states. All because one small child had recognized a dog in a courtroom and spoken the truth. The courtroom was packed 3 weeks later when the custody hearing reconvened. Word of the dog-fighting operation had spread through the legal community like wildfire, and judges, attorneys, and journalists filled every available seat. This was no longer a routine custody dispute. This had become a landmark case, a 3-year-old's innocent observation that had unraveled a criminal enterprise and raised critical questions about child safety and predatory behavior. Judge entered with her usual stern demeanor, though something had shifted in her expression. She looked at David with barely concealed contempt. The man who'd presented himself as a concerned, involved father 3 weeks earlier now sat in an orange jumpsuit, having been unable to make bail on the multiple felony charges. Richard Thornton, David's expensive attorney, had withdrawn from the case the day after the raid. The situation had become indefensible, and Thornton's reputation didn't survive association with dog fighting and child endangerment. David now faced a public defender, a competent woman named Jennifer Martinez, who looked profoundly uncomfortable representing a client whose guilt was so overwhelmingly documented. "This court will reconvene the custody matter of Mitchell versus Mitchell," Judge announced. However, given the criminal charges now filed against respondent David Mitchell, this proceeding has fundamentally changed in character and scope. She turned to Sarah, who sat holding Emma's hand. Sarah's face was pale but resolute. The past 3 weeks had been a blur of police interviews, trauma counseling sessions for Emma, and careful preparation for this hearing. "Mrs. Mitchell," Judge continued, "you sought primary custody of your daughter, Emma. The evidence presented at the previous hearing, combined with subsequent criminal investigation, demonstrates conclusively that you are the appropriate custodial parent. In fact, the evidence reveals that granting Mr. Mitchell any form of custody would place Emma in significant danger." She paused, her expression hardening as she looked at David. The defendant has not only engaged in criminal activity, but has deliberately weaponized his relationship with his daughter to maintain silence regarding that criminal activity. He threatened Emma's access to her mother, her primary attachment figure, to ensure her compliance and silence regarding animal abuse and criminal enterprise. Judge adjusted her glasses and continued. "The psychological impact on a 3-year-old of being exposed to systematic animal cruelty and then threatened into silence cannot be overstated. Emma Mitchell has been a victim of both her father's direct criminal activity and the emotional manipulation that accompanied it." David's head was down, his shoulders slumped. Jennifer Martinez had placed a hand on his arm, but there was nothing she could say in his defense. "The court hereby awards full legal and physical custody of Emma Mitchell to Sarah Mitchell," Judge declared. "This custody arrangement is effective immediately and shall remain in effect pending the outcome of criminal proceedings and any appellate processes that may follow." Sarah's hands went to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Emma, still not fully understanding what was happening but sensing her mother's relief, hugged Sarah tightly. "Furthermore," Judge continued, "all visitation rights for Mr. David Mitchell are suspended indefinitely. Specifically, Mr. Mitchell shall have 0 unsupervised contact with Emma Mitchell until such time as he completes, to the satisfaction of this court, 1. A comprehensive psychological evaluation and determination that he no longer poses a threat to the child. 2. Completion of court-ordered anger management and parenting classes. 3. Evidence of sustained rehabilitation and behavioral modification. 4. Successful completion of his criminal sentences without further infractions. 5. Approval from a court-appointed family psychologist, confirming that contact with Emma would not be traumatic or damaging." Judge looked directly at David. "Mr. Mitchell, the evidence suggests that you used your daughter as a tool to further your criminal enterprise and as a means of maintaining operational security. You threatened her with loss of maternal relationship to ensure her silence regarding systematic animal abuse. In my 28 years on the bench, I have rarely encountered such egregious misuse of paternal rights." She turned back to Sarah. "Mrs. Mitchell, the court recognizes that you acted as a devoted, protective parent throughout these proceedings. Your commitment to Emma's welfare has been consistently demonstrated. I would also note that your earlier concerns about Mr. Mitchell's behavior during visitation, concerns that were dismissed during the preliminary phases of this case, were, in fact, entirely justified and reflected appropriate maternal instinct." Squeezed Sarah's hand, the vindication evident in every line of her face. "Additionally," Judge continued, "this court is recommending that Emma receive trauma-informed therapy with a child psychologist specializing in exposure to animal abuse and parental manipulation. These sessions will be court-ordered, and Mr. Mitchell will be responsible for all associated costs as part of his restitution." She looked toward the prosecutor's office representative sitting in the courtroom. "I'm also forwarding a detailed report to the district attorney's office regarding the child endangerment charges. The deliberate psychological manipulation of a minor to facilitate criminal activity warrants enhanced sentencing consideration." The prosecutor nodded grimly. The child endangerment charges alone could add years to David's potential sentence. "Mr. Mitchell," Judge said, fixing him with a final, penetrating stare, "you demonstrated that you are fundamentally unfit for parental responsibility, not merely because you engaged in criminal activity, but because you exploited your daughter as a means to further that activity. That represents a profound betrayal of the trust and vulnerability that children place in their parents." David's public defender was making notes, clearly planning to use this hearing as testimony to mitigating circumstances or evidence of the judge's bias during sentencing arguments. But even she seemed to understand that nothing could genuinely defend her client's actions. "This hearing is concluded," Judge announced. "Bailiff, remand the defendant to custody pending trial preparation." As officers approached to take David back to the holding area, he turned toward Sarah with an expression of pure malice. But before he could speak, the bailiff was ushering him away, and Sarah deliberately looked away from him, focusing entirely on Emma. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded around Sarah, shouting questions about the case, about Emma, about her experience navigating the legal system. Stood between Sarah and the cameras, making a brief statement. "My client is that the court has recognized the truth and that Emma's safety is now secured. Justice has prevailed not through complex legal argumentation, but through a child's honest observation of reality. We hope this case raises awareness about the importance of listening to children and taking their statements seriously." Sarah held Emma close, both of them squinting in the bright afternoon sunlight. Photographers captured the image, a relieved mother and her small daughter, finally safe. That evening, Sarah and Emma sat together on their couch, watching Emma's favorite children's program. Sarah had called her mother to update her on the ruling. Carol had wept openly, relieved that her granddaughter was finally truly safe. "Mommy," Emma's small voice interrupted Sarah's thoughts. "Yes, sweetheart." "Are the doggies okay now, the sad doggies?" Sarah pulled Emma closer, her heart simultaneously breaking and healing. "Yes, baby, the doggies are safe now. They're with people who love them and will help them feel better." "Because I told the judge about them." "Yes, because you were so brave and told the truth." Emma seemed satisfied with this answer and returned her attention to the television. But Sarah continued holding her daughter, marveling at the resilience of childhood and the profound truth that sometimes the most powerful testimonies come from the mouths of the young and innocent. The custody battle that had consumed 8 months of Sarah's life was finally over. David Mitchell sat in a jail cell awaiting trial on multiple felonies. 12 dogs were receiving veterinary care and rehabilitation. And Emma, precious, brave, innocent Emma, was finally home where she belonged, safe from a predator who'd worn the mask of a father. Justice didn't always arrive through complex legal strategy or expensive attorneys. Sometimes it came through the unexpected courage of a 3-year-old girl who simply told the truth. 6 months had passed since the courtroom revelation that changed everything. Sarah sat on the back porch of her apartment on a warm summer evening, watching Emma play in the small yard they shared with neighbors. Her daughter was laughing, genuinely laughing, for the first time since that terrible day when the police dog appeared in the courthouse. The criminal trial had concluded 3 weeks earlier. David Mitchell received a 7-year sentence for animal cruelty, illegal dog fighting, money laundering, and wire fraud. The child endangerment charge carried an additional 2 years, all sentences to be served consecutively. The judge had been unsparing in her pronouncements, calling David's actions predatory, systematic, and fundamentally evil. His public defender had attempted to argue for leniency, citing various mitigating factors: a difficult childhood, substance abuse issues, psychological problems. But Judge had dismissed these arguments with barely concealed contempt. She'd stated that David's deliberate manipulation of his daughter to maintain operational security demonstrated a degree of moral corruption that transcended typical criminal behavior. "You didn't just commit crimes," Judge had said during sentencing. "You weaponized paternal relationship itself. You corrupted the most fundamental human bond, the trust between parent and child, to serve your criminal enterprise. That represents a specific species of evil that society must punish severely." David would be 61 years old when released, assuming no appeals or additional charges arose from ongoing investigations into the broader dog-fighting network. Federal authorities had been collaborating with local law enforcement, and evidence suggested that David's operation was connected to a multi-state criminal organization. There was a real possibility of additional federal charges. Sarah didn't think much about David anymore. She'd been in therapy herself, trauma-informed therapy designed for people who'd navigated the criminal justice system, and her therapist had helped her process the complicated emotions: the guilt for not seeing the signs sooner, the rage at his manipulation, and gradually, the peace that came from understanding that she was not responsible for his choices. Emma's therapy was progressing better than expected. Her child psychologist, Dr. Robert, had indicated that Emma showed remarkable resilience. Children were more adaptable than people often gave them credit for, Doctor had explained. Emma was still processing what had happened, but her nightmares had decreased from several times weekly to perhaps once every 2 weeks. She was sleeping better, eating normally, and her characteristic cheerfulness was returning gradually. The one consistent request Emma made was to visit the doggy rescue place. Sarah had taken her twice to the facility where the rescued dogs were being rehabilitated. Emma had been fascinated by the animals, and surprisingly, several of the dogs responded positively to her presence. There was something intuitive in Emma's gentleness, and the dogs seemed to recognize a kindred spirit, another survivor, another being who'd known trauma and emerged from it. Sarah's mother had suggested that Emma might benefit from getting a dog of her own eventually, once she was older and the animals had fully recovered. Sarah hadn't dismissed the idea. Perhaps a dog that had survived what Emma had witnessed could be a powerful symbol of healing and resilience. The rescue organization had kept detailed records of each dog's progress. Of the 12 animals seized from David's basement, 10 had survived and were progressing through rehabilitation. 2 had been too severely injured, and euthanasia had been necessary, a heartbreaking but compassionate decision. But the 10 survivors represented a remarkable victory. One dog in particular had captured Sarah's attention. Her records identified her as Queen, the breeding dog who'd been repeatedly exploited. Despite her trauma, Queen had demonstrated an unexpected capacity for trust. She was now in a foster home with an elderly woman named Ruth Summers, who'd contacted the rescue organization specifically requesting an animal with a difficult history. "I want to give her a home where she can learn that humans can be safe," Ruth had written in her foster application. That application had been approved immediately. Sarah had received a letter from Ruth just last week, complete with photographs. Queen had learned to play again. She was learning that toys weren't weapons and that human hands could provide comfort rather than pain. Ruth described how Queen would rest her head on Ruth's lap while they watched television together, how she'd learned to wag her tail, how she was slowly becoming the dog she might have been if she'd never met David Mitchell. Seeing those photographs had made Sarah cry, not from sadness, but from a profound sense of justice and redemption. Every recovered dog represented a victory, a life saved, a being given a second chance. The case had generated significant media attention and had been featured in several documentary-style television programs about the criminal justice system and animal welfare. Legal scholars had written about how judge handling of the case demonstrated the importance of judicial discretion and the dangers of prioritizing legal procedure over obvious moral reality. Sarah's attorney had been asked to speak at several law conferences about representing parents in custody battles when there are underlying safety concerns. She'd become something of an advocate within the legal community for greater sensitivity to warning signs that might indicate criminal activity beneath custody disputes. "Your daughter's testimony saved not just her own life," had told Sarah. "It quite possibly prevented future victims. When law enforcement investigated David's network, they connected him to several other ongoing criminal investigations. Your case essentially provided the thread that authorities pulled to unravel a much larger operation." Sarah had processed this information with mixed feelings. She was that Emma's bravery had had such profound consequences, but she also carried a strange guilt about David. Not guilt that he'd been caught, but guilt that she'd initially been manipulated by him, that she doubted her own instincts about him, that she'd nearly lost custody of Emma to someone so fundamentally damaged. Her therapist had helped her understand that this guilt was itself a manifestation of manipulation. Sarah had been conditioned by years of marriage to David to doubt her own perceptions. Recognizing that pattern and releasing that guilt was part of her healing process. On this summer evening, as Sarah watched Emma play, she reflected on how much had changed. The custody battle that had consumed 8 months of her life seemed like ancient history. The legal victory felt almost anticlimactic compared to the ongoing work of actual healing, the daily therapy sessions, the nightmares that still occasionally visited Emma's sleep, the careful rebuilding of trust in the world. Emma ran inside, suddenly tired from play, and curled up next to Sarah on the porch couch. "Mommy, tell me again about the doggy who helped me in court." Sarah smiled. Emma had asked this question dozens of times over the past months, and Sarah had been advised by doctor to answer it honestly each time, allowing Emma to process the memory in her own way. "That was Officer Martinez's dog, a German shepherd named King," Sarah said, stroking Emma's hair. "When you saw King in the courtroom, you recognized that he looked like the dogs at Daddy's house, and because you told the truth about what you saw, all those sick dogs got to go to a place where they could get better." "And Daddy?" Emma asked quietly. "Daddy made bad choices," Sarah said carefully, using language that doctor had recommended. "He hurt animals and he broke laws. Right now, he's in a place called jail where people go when they've done something very wrong. Eventually, he'll have to face consequences for his choices." Emma nodded solemnly, absorbing this information the way only a child could, with a clarity that adults often failed to achieve. She didn't fully understand the complexity of criminal justice, but she understood that her father had done something wrong, that there had been consequences, and that her mother was keeping her safe. Sarah held her daughter close as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. 6 months ago, her life had been defined by fear and legal warfare. Now, it was defined by healing, hope, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that a small child's simple truth had changed everything. The rescued dogs were learning to trust again. Emma was learning that the world still contained goodness. Sarah was learning that sometimes justice emerges not through clever legal strategies or expensive attorneys, but through the unexpected clarity of a 3-year-old girl who simply pointed at a dog and told the truth. And in that truth, all of them, the mother, the daughter, and 12 suffering animals, had found their path to freedom. The end.